Good morning, everyone, and welcome to dojolive this Wednesday, December 14th, 2022. My name is Kit Lantis, and it's my pleasure to be spending some time with you today. And you know what today is? It is the show number 4 of 4 in our first AWS series. It's my pleasure to introduce Art Chan, Senior Partner Solutions Architect at Amazon Web Services, and Isaac Sosa. He is a DevOps and Cloud Innovation Leader at Ancora. Thank you both for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Kim.
Here.
Yeah, my pleasure. So Art, you've been around for a bit now with 4 of 4 shows. If you can just give us a real quick idea for those who may not have catched those shows, who you are and what your story is about with AWS.
Yeah, so just to kind of recap, on our first series, we talked about migration. There's a lot of talk about when's the right time to move to the cloud. And I think because of the elastic nature of the cloud and the ability to scale up and scale down, it's with an economic uncertainty right now, there's a lot of reasons, good reasons to move to the cloud. We talked about specifics once you move to the cloud, how to structure your workloads into different microservices architectures. On show number 2, we talked about containerization of these microservices. On show 3, we talked about serverless.
That's right.
And yeah, exactly, how those pieces fit together. But there's always concerns about how these pieces might be very granular, and how do you coordinate and orchestrate them all into one coherent development methodology. And that's what we're going to talk about today, the whole DevOps on AWS.
That's right. We've talked about that processing power microservices architecture, and now we're going to dive into the orchestration behind it, I suppose, which is exactly what you do, Isaac. Thank you for joining us real quick. Before we dive in, to that deeper dive summary and get into this new stuff today, that DevOps focus. What's your story? What have you done that's led up to your interest in DevOps?
Yeah, so I have a background in development. I was a Java developer for a long time and working on the back end. And then I started picking up some automation tasks and started specializing in DevOps. So I've been studying and practicing DevOps for the last 6 to 7 years, and became a DevOps and Cloud Innovation Leader at Ancora.
All right. Well, welcome, and joining us all the way from Brazil, right outside of Sao Paulo. Nice. I love it. So here we are suffering our winter months, and Isaac's in the middle of summer, living the life. I love it. So thank you. Thank you again for joining us, and of course, being able to share your expertise with us. So as you've already stated, Art, we've made the case that microservices are pretty great. But I guess we can kind of kick off into, how do we put this into a sort of coherent framework, right? If I'm using the right words there. Is that where sort of DevOps comes in?
Yeah, so it's somewhat the glue that stitches a lot of this together. When you're using microservices, you could be focused on developing your application. The developer can use AWS tools to not know anything about infrastructure. They don't have to deploy infrastructure. They can use DevOps tools to do the development on their local hosts. Tools like SAM allow them to do serverless development and not actually have to have remote resources. They can test locally. There are other mechanisms that like Elastic Beanstalk, which will transparently provision some of these tools behind them, the infrastructure behind them, so developers can do what they do best, focus on development instead of the infrastructure. The DevOps tools will also tie together things that developers already know about, right? Code repositories, checking in code into code commit, building code build, doing the requisite testing, and using things like code deploy to deploy their code into the infrastructure. Because the infrastructure is defined as code, you can spin up that infrastructure as just exactly as if it was in production, without having to set anything up ahead of time. It can be deployed at time of code deployment as part of your code pipeline. So this enables organizations to develop and release code very rapidly. You can make changes, check it into your source repository, have everything automated in the back end all the way to the deployment phase.
Yeah, and I think actually that makes a lot of sense. And I think really what we wanted to talk about today, and I think Isaac, you can maybe speak more to this with your hands-on experiences, what you're doing as an engineer yourself, but this idea of enabling a fast release cycle, right? Which is what's more and more important for more and more software development companies these days, particularly I think as we've made, or they have made, or are making the shift from what used to be a more sort of waterfall methodology to what is agile methodology, right? In the past, with waterfall, tasks are much more of a linear process, where agile, to my understanding, is more iterative and cyclic and collaborative. So this ability to hit go only when you need it that you're referring to makes a lot of sense. Is this a better fit for that agile methodology?
Yeah, definitely. So with Agile, you have short cycles where you have to deliver value to the product quickly and iterate over it. So you want to produce a new feature or new code, and you have to put it in front of users in order to make it available, to test it, to validate it. And in order to have this fast release cycle, you need automation, and you need a streamlined development process where you are able to build, to verify, to test, and to release your application with quality and in a reliable way. So DevOps will enable this. It will build the processes and the automation in order to enable these fast release cycles.
That's fascinating. Let's dive a little bit more into, I think, what did you call infrastructure as code, or perhaps is that short for IAC? Is that what the cool kids say?
Yeah, that's it.
What does that look like in terms of, let's say, outcomes for businesses, but also their customers? You guys, maybe Isaac, either one of you, talk a bit more on that?
So what might be useful is to compare the before and after, right? So before,
Yeah.
I mean, the development automation is nothing new. I mean, we've been doing development automation for decades, right? The key difference here is development automation is tied to the infrastructure. Because infrastructure is defined as code, you can now, number one, do things with your infrastructure that you couldn't before. You can actually check that into a source repository. You could do code reviews against your infrastructure and how it's defined. And then tie that to the back end of your development automation framework. So in your DevOps pipeline, the last bit is to actually provision that infrastructure and test it. So previously, you had to have a whole test, typically have a test team deploy and standardize that infrastructure before a deployment was made to it. Now you can just deploy a brand new infrastructure and test against it. And when you're done with your testing, simply turn it off and you're no longer paying for that resource. But the idea behind this is it's a fresh infrastructure, it's a fresh resource, and everything configured on it is exactly as you defined in your software definition of that infrastructure. So when you do move to production, there's no operator mistakes that can happen between the time you put your operations production definition down on paper and when your operator actually types in the commands to set up that infrastructure. All that goes away.
Wow. So that is this idea. I can really see how that's a much more continuous and much more quick, rapid kind of improvement in that. Isaac, how have you seen this maybe play out in some of your own experiences as an engineer?
Yeah, so one thing that Art mentioned that is critical for most companies is being able to test the code before releasing it and testing it in a reliable way in an environment that's similar to the production environment. So having DevOps and infrastructure as code is critical for that, because you're able to use the same code that you use for production in a test environment. And you're also able to provision to your developers a brand new environment for them to test their own code. So that also enables them to use an environment that's similar to production for their own development, which catches problems earlier in the cycle and makes them easier to fix and also cheaper fix. And using infrastructure as code, since it's code, you can also use practices that are now mainstream for code, like code reviews, like code validation, code scanning. You can apply that to infrastructure as well. So you can perform code reviews on your infrastructure. You can analyze the changes that will be applied to your infrastructure and catch problems before they are actually applied to production. You can also run validators, you can run security scans, you can run quality checks on your infrastructure code and make sure that everything is correct and has good quality before shipping it. Yeah.
Yeah, you also brought up a very good point about testing and structuring your tests adequately. Historically, tests have been always very difficult to construct, just simply because in a development environment or a test environment, a lot of times you just simply cannot procure enough resources to test that service or the system, much like in a production environment. So you've seen this historically, people test and test and test, and everything works great in test and QA. They put it in production and everything falls apart, right? And
sometimes it works on my machine.
Exactly. So the advantage of a DevOps pipeline on a cloud infrastructure is that you can actually set up a test case where you're simulating real production environment because you have the capacity. You essentially have unlimited resources to hit up that service, so to speak, so that you can set up your tests that mimic real world better than you can in a on-prem test environment.
Yeah, and the better part is that you can turn it off once you're finished. So you save on costs there. So you don't have to procure a huge data center just to make a performance test work. You can just start it up on the cloud and then turn it off when you're done.
That's fascinating. So what I'm hearing about all of this, and I think this is sort of this thread that's come through all three shows and into our fourth show: elasticity, flexibility, cost savings. But now it's where we're beginning to see, I think, this bigger idea of risk reduction, right? Which is also, I think, really important to businesses themselves, and then how that sort of domino effects down to the customer. So what about, like, what other types of risks are we reducing, or what does that look like in terms of benefits to you, and as an engineer and the dynamics on your engineering teams, but all the way kind of through that entire business cycle? What type of risk are we reducing, short term, long term?
Well, we're certainly removing infrastructure risk, not having to procure equipment and infrastructure that may not be used or utilized very limited through for just, say, like one purpose, for test, for example. Now you're only turning on that infrastructure when you actually need to do the test, instead of have it spinning idle and waiting for QA and test engineers to provision to it. You're also reducing risk around headcount on the operation side, because with the development, if your infrastructure is provisioned through code, you no longer need operations staff to maintain those systems. Those can be provisioned up and down through the software deployment process, the same way as any other bit of code that you deploy into production. Those resources can now be retasked to more high value things for the operation. So developing the code that's core to that company, to the key differentiator, as opposed to doing all the undifferentiated heavy lifting of patching servers, deploying servers, cabling servers. I mean, who wants to do that, right?
For sure. Isaac, do you have any stories that you can share in terms of your experience of getting rid of that busy work, so to speak, and allowing you to just really deep dive and be creative in terms of new features and just different elements that you've been able to create for your employers, your business, the projects you're working on?
Yeah, sure. One great aspect of DevOps and automation and infrastructure as code is that you can share the code that you build. So let's say your company has a bunch of web services that need to be built, tested, deployed. You don't need to write the same code for each each one of them, or provision the same infrastructure manually for each one of them. You can create a base template with the best practices applied to it, following the security guidelines, following with observability, with metrics, alerting, etc. You can build a template out of it and just use this base template as the foundation for all of your web services. And in that way, you reduce development time, you increase quality, you increase security. And we were able to apply that into several projects that we have worked here at Encora. We build what's called an internal development platform, where we are automating, we're building tools, we're building templates, we are including the best practices into these templates. And this platform is then used by developers to build their software, which makes them a lot more productive in their development, and the end result has more quality and more security.
Awesome. Is it just more fun for you as an individual, as an engineer? Like, what do you get from this?
Yeah, no one likes to do manual tasks that require no thinking. It's just clicking buttons on a screen. No one likes to do that.
Unless it's a Friday
yeah,
mood.
maybe on a slow Friday, maybe. So doing automation and thinking on the best way to implement something, to implement infrastructure, thinking on how something should be monitored, how something can break, and you can provide reliability, resilience, high availability, scalability. All of these things you have to think about when you're doing DevOps, and you can actually codify those patterns into code that will then provision infrastructure. So that's, for me at least, it's a lot more fun than provisioning services through a web interface, for instance, or even worse, in a on-premises data center, maybe cabling and stacking servers on a hack. That's not fun.
Yeah, sitting on a cold raised floor with the air conditioning blowing on you. That's no fun.
Yeah, have to go into the site with a parka. I love it.
In there. But yeah, I think exactly right. I mean, this it changes the paradigm so that, you know, we're getting into a software-defined world with a lot of things, in, not just technology, but in ordinary life. And this allows you to define your infrastructure as software in conjunction with development of software. So it's very pure from that perspective, and it lets you do things along with your code and your deployment that you couldn't possibly do before, where you had to manually do these installs. So tools like CDK, I think I mentioned serverless, the SAM tool, other things like Elastic Beanstalk. All those tools will help developers rapidly develop with or without that infrastructure backend. But at the end of the day, they don't really need to think about that backend as they're developing. It just happens, and that eases and relieves the burden for a lot of developers.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I think you mentioned, you know, of course, a lot of the tools, the DevOps tools that are enabling this, and like their higher level functions. Beanstalk, I think that's super fun. It reminds me of the Silicon Valley Pied Piper. I don't know. Why is everything always like fantasy based? But Isaac, how about you? Like, what has your story been like? What's your particular tool set that you prefer? Do you have any sort of favorites out there?
Well, I prefer to use what's best for the use case at hand, right? And that's a generic response. I'm not saying a particular tool, but it's true, right? Each client, each product has a different culture of development, has a different set of requirements around quality, around security, and requires a different strategy, a different set of tools. Maybe they want to use everything on the cloud, including the DevOps tool. Maybe they want to use only the cloud for the production infrastructure, and they want to use other tools that they are more used to in other providers. which is all fine. The great thing about working at a company like Encora is that you are exposed to a lot of clients that are different sizes in different industries with different cultures, and you can learn from them, and you can know which tools, which practices works in each scenario. And having this knowledge, you can quickly know which tools to apply on each case. So that's a great advantage of a services provider like Encora, because it has
Yeah.
this collective knowledge that you can then know the best thing to do in each scenario.
Yeah, because I was actually going to ask you about that, because obviously over these past few weeks, the benefits of cloud, microservices, DevOps, it's all very clear to me. And I was just going to say, I think it makes a lot of sense. And if companies have the ability, of course, to roll that out, it's really a no-brainer. But that was my question of what happens if it does feel a little, where do I start? This is kind of daunting for me. What kind of options are there? And you kind of brought that up with the idea of engaging with a partner, someone like Encora.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Having someone that has gone through the process already always helps. Yeah.
Very cool, because then you don't have to struggle with the where do I get started. And I think it's interesting, like the process of really having those conversations and starting out, what are your needs, what do you want to accomplish, and being able to select the appropriate tool for that, and that kind of broad knowledge, right, of what might be the best option for any given circumstance. Are there any kind of processes, or what does that process look like in terms of counseling, different companies and your partners at AWS to sort of work through that and to select what works best for them?
Yeah, so at AWS, we generally like to recommend to work backwards from the customer's business requirements. So if a customer comes to us for a particular workload recommendation on how to get that migrated to the cloud, we either can give them direct advice or refer them to a partner like Encora to make that recommendation. But the idea is that we look at the workload, we try to understand what services will best fit that architecture. We like to make sure that these new workloads that move to the cloud adhere to our well-architected principles. So it covers everything from scalability, reliability, so operational best practices, even sustainability is our new sixth pillar as part of the well-architected program. We'll take all those items into consideration and then architect a workload that meets that requirement. Customers sometimes don't always want to do everything. I mean, there's obviously, we understand customers want to have a particular amount of money or budget for a particular project that they set aside. So, some customers may choose to do the full redundancy or full availability, and some might want to do a scaled back version, for example. So in either way, customers that are looking to move to the cloud, they should consider reaching out to either an AWS partner or AWS, and happy to help them work backwards.
Yeah, I like that approach. And just simply knowing the right questions, I think, to ask, at least for me, brings a lot of peace of mind. In life in general, I mean, I'm not the one who's the decision maker on moving to the cloud or not. But I think when when someone has that approach of like, okay, asking those right questions, I think it really makes a lot of sense. It takes off that pressure and that overbearing sort of, how can I get this, even the ball rolling kind of element. It makes a lot of sense. Perfect. So as we're wrapping up today, again, the 4 of 4 of what is our first AWS series, I think, is there any final sort of words of wisdom or suggestions that you want to kind of throw out there for anyone interested, of course, on how to really just enable a fast release cycle and get this going?
Yeah,
I think the recommendation.
Excuse me.
Go ahead, Isaac.
Thanks.
Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I would say start small. Pick the low-hanging fruits first. Try to decide. Try to see what your developers need at the moment and start implementing it and build a journey. Right. So it's a journey. It can be a long process, but each step provides value and is definitely worth it. So my advice here would be to start small.
Yeah, I would echo that sentiment, and also recommend that that we have a number of free services and a free tier for most of our services. So people should be comfortable hopping onto the system, signing up for a free account, testing out the different services, and in this case, the DevOps services, and run an experiment, see how easy it is, and look at some of the developer tools. There's some fascinating developer tools that were released at reInvent just a few weeks ago, and I'm as excited to test them out as I'm sure many of your viewers are. So I'd say learn and be curious, and hop on our platform and take a look.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And I like the journey analogy, right? Because all journeys start with the first step. And so why wait? Just start walking, and we can do that today. I love it. Well, thank you so much, Art, Isaac, for joining us on Dojolive to share all about the cloud, microservices, AWS, and for teaching us, and sharing your knowledge with us. We greatly appreciate it.
My pleasure.
All right. Well, thanks for having us.
You're welcome. Stick around for just a minute before we go off air, because talking about a new journey, a different type of journey, we do have our final Dojolive show of 2022, if you can believe it or not. That's happening tomorrow at 10 o'clock Pacific. And we're going to be speaking with Mike Lee, who is the CEO at Fundica. And he's talking about the journey of fundraising, right? How to democratize access to funding, and how to become a funding champion for small and medium-sized businesses and the underrepresented. So if you're looking to start your own entrepreneurial journey, that of course is a great show for you. So see you then. And thank you once again, Art and Isaac. Goodbye for now.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.